Yeah, it's really exciting.
Yeah, I always like this part. It's the magic happens and we get to see names and faces pop up that normally I wouldn't necessarily get to see unless walking on campus. This
I
is
like the aspirational backgrounds that people have. Um,
yes.
Views of the mountains with rivers and lakes.
It's very zen. Yeah, this call is recorded. Sorry, this session is recorded. The recording is on currently right now. Um, as people are logging on, just letting you know that there is also a live transcript happening. So I invite you to turn that on should you find that tool useful for you. You can enable captions by clicking on the button towards the bottom right of your Zoom screen, usually right next to the reactions button. So as with most healthy workplace events, we're going to start at 1:05. Just give people a chance to log on, switch hats, maybe grab some food and have some lunch. Thank you. People are commenting on my hair. I love it. It's somewhat a little more ambitious than originally planned. But I have a feeling that pretty soon it's going to overtake my whole head. This is great. It's great having you here, Laura. And as we're running, this is a part of our accessibility speaker series with Healthy Workplace. And some people might be wondering, why am I not hearing Sam? Sam is here. If you search, you can find her video. This is a sanctioned event. Sam has given it her seal of approval. We're just shaking up the voices a little bit. Just remember that if you ever have a healthy workplace idea, you may be the one introducing people. Great. So we're at around 80 participants. So you're invited to turn on live transcript if that's helpful for you. You will find that in the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom screen. A reminder for those that have come on recently, this session is being recorded and it's currently being recorded. So if you would like to turn off your video, then you have a moment to do that. Even though we spotlight our guest speaker during this part of the recording, it's just so you're aware of your own privacy options. And I will get started. So thank you all for joining us here today. This is the third session in the Accessibility and Wellness Speaker Series. It is co-hosted by Healthy Workplace, as well as the READ Initiative on campus. Today's session is called Academics with ADHD, Making the University Workplace More Accessible for Neurodivergent People. I am Kathy Malcolm Edwards. I work in READ and I am leading the implementation for the coordinated accessibility strategy on campus, which takes into account both visible and non-visible disabilities, as well as looking at just general functional limitations that we may experience. I want to begin by acknowledging the land on which Carleton University is situated. It's the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. And I, for one, am very grateful for this land on which I live, work, and play. I recognize not everyone here may be in territory of Algonquin. So if you just take a moment and just pay a bit of gratitude for the land on which you are working, living, and playing, that would be great. So just before I formally introduce our speaker today, just a reminder, there's been a couple more people join, that this session is being recorded. So we are spotlighting our guest speaker's video, but I would give you the option, if you would like if you would like to at this point, to turn your video off so you have your privacy controls, if that's what you feel like doing. Closed captioning is available. You can enable this by clicking on the button called Live Transcript with the CC button towards the bottom of your Zoom screen towards the right. A link for the recording will be shared later today as well. I forgot to mention that part. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and we will address those towards the end of the presentation. Now to introduce our guest speaker today. I am honored to introduce Associate Professor Paul Peters from the Department of Health Sciences at Carleton. Paul's research is on the spatial and statistical patterns of mortality, the environmental impacts on health, and health in small rural places within the context of structural inequities and social inequalities. He runs a very active research lab on our campus. It currently supports around 20 students that are across different levels of study, as well as different fields of study on campus. I'm very grateful that I got to actually hear Paul speak this past term as a guest lecturer, and his combination of curiosity as well as clarity brought to light his dedication to his work. In preparing for that class, I did what a lot of us do, and I went to Dr. Google, and I thought I wanted to find out a bit more about who is coming to speak in our class. And that's when I discovered Paul's open, honest communication about living with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, otherwise we know as the acronym ADHD. Now, ADHD is, some people would qualify it as saying it's a brain disorder that impacts the executive functions of the brain. And this can cause challenges with impulse control, focus, or even organization. Now, Paul has consciously chosen to be open about his ADHD diagnosis with colleagues and students, and he seeks to provide mentorship to students from diverse backgrounds and to place value on personal growth and learning. I have so been looking forward for the past few weeks for this talk, and I'm very excited now to hand it over to Paul. Welcome, and the stage is yours.
Wow, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Kathy. I think my talk's done. Kathy said everything there. No, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to my colleagues at the university, from across the university, when we don't get much chance to interact with each other on a large basis, and on something that has impacted me on a very much personal and professional level, but isn't actually part of my research. So I don't research ADHD. I'm not an ADHD expert, and I'm going to talk to you today about ADHD in the workplace and as an ADHD academic from a place of lived experience, not based on that, and based on my anything that I present from research will be based on my own interpretation of it, not based on anything that I've done. So I'm just going to share my screen here with my. Find sharing my desktop easier, and then I will just give this a little start. So yeah, my talk is on, I say, making the university workplace more accessible for neurodivergent people, and that was because Kathy had approached me talking about invisible disabilities and things that we might need accessibility for, and ADHD is one of them. So how did I prepare for this talk? Well, this is kind of what it looked like. Substitute the messy room with the messy ideas of a presentation, and me looking like I was doing nothing except not working the presentation. But this is what it actually felt like. So while I wasn't working my presentation, all this was going on and behind in my brain, all about the presentation, how I was going to do it, how I was going to structure it, what was I going to say, what was I going to include, all these different things. I think a lot of us can feel it, but this is very much an ADHD, and from the perspective of myself with ADHD. So I could start this a logical way and tell you a story from beginning to end, or I could do it the way I should as an ADHD story and provide you some prologue for context and start it and give you some details, and then a little bit of backstory, and I'll go back and forth. I'm going to do it in 3 parts. Number 1, let's talk about my ADHD journey. than ADHD in the workplace. Then I'm going to give a little bit of hint of some supports that could be done in the workplace for supporting others with ADHD. If you run out of time, I'll sort of gloss over that, but that will be available in the presentation as well. So I have ADHD. And when I tell people this, they often don't look at it because I've got a PhD. I've got 3 kids. I'm very active in their lives. My house is quite neat. My office is immaculate. I attend meetings on time. I've been relatively successful. But so what, how could I have that? I don't look like I have that. But, we don't all look the same, because as a kid, there were lots of things that would happen to me that looking back on it, I realized were ADHD. And I can really relate to this comic because I often do spend a lot of my time masking and doing things to participate, to compensate for that. But then when I get home, I can be absolutely exhausted from pretending I don't have ADHD. How did I learn I had ADHD in the beginning of my struggles? It started with this. This is the, a diagnostic self-report scale screening questionnaire. It actually started with one for my son, who at the time was 9, and filling one out for him. And my wife called me at work and said, "Hey, Paul, I think you should do it. Here's the link." And I did it, and I redid it just recently. This was what we come up with. And you can see that I'm sitting in the gray area for a lot of these things. And it was like, huh, really? Do you actually think I could have ADHD? My wife's like, yeah, that can explain a lot. But part of that was I didn't actually know what ADHD was. I had an idea, a preconceived notion of what it looks like, right? But I didn't actually have an idea. And that's because often when we think of ADHD, we think of this. We think of the hyperactive impulsive ADHD. And we think of ADHD boys often as this hyperactive, right? But there's actually, primarily 3 types they talk about. One is ADHD hyperactive impulsive. The other one is inattentive, what they would have called ADD. And then there's the combined. I'm ADHD inattentive. So I'm not visibly hyperactive, although if you were able to see, you'll notice that I'm fidgeting constantly. I have some fidget things down here. Little fidget toys that I carry with me, and things like that. So I am always doing these things. And it's because of this preconceived notion. I didn't think that I actually was. So we think of ADHD as young boys who fidget a lot, struggle in school, and can't pay attention. But really, it's someone who can be introverted or extroverted at any age, any gender, who may or may not be hyperactive, who may excel or struggle in school, and has difficulty regulating attention rather than difficulty paying attention. And this is something that we'll get, what I'll talk about later. But what does regulating attention look like to me? Just a side note, I'm going to do this entire presentation with comics and things like that. They're all credited underneath. And if you follow me on Twitter, you'll find I repost that a lot. So going back to this, so I had been initially diagnosed when I was in university with generalized anxiety disorder. I saw a psychologist and a psychiatrist, and they had prescribed me talk therapy and medication. And I had been doing that since about 2003, taking medication and seeing therapist for that. And how did that square then with ADHD? Well, if I actually look at the diagnostic self-report scale, the parts where I'm only a sometimes or a rarely on, well, those all relate to my anxiety. What I was doing is I was masking all these elements. So I used to be constantly late. I have a lot of trouble telling time and when things are. I'm constantly looking at my watch, constantly looking at my calendar. I asked my wife 1,000,000 times today, so you don't have a client between 1 and 2. I can use the office between 1 and 2. and I would always get it mixed up between 12 and 1 or 1 and 2. I could never remember at all today. So what I do is I compensate for that. So I can't relax before any appointments. I haven't been able to relax all day. So I tend to arrive a lot early. I'm prepared a lot early. I often forget what I want to say, so I keep switching topics. So I just don't talk about myself. So I do these types of masking that I don't do. So being hyperactive and clumsy. I used to be hyperactive in school until I got in trouble for it. And then I forcefully didn't do that in about grade 5. I stopped being loud. I stopped being gregarious in class. I became a quiet kid sitting in the corner. It was very much a masking and doing that. So that creates anxiety. So being diagnosed with ADHD overall was a huge relief. So before my ADHD diagnosis, I was, what if it turns out I don't have ADHD and I'm just looking at excuse for my laziness? What if it's that? And of course, afterwards, then it's like, well, what if my acting was really good? What if I tricked my specialist into diagnosing me? I did see a psychologist and had a formal diagnosis through a psychologist as well as through a physician. So, and I've seen multiple psychologists for that. So, but that's normal after that, particularly for adults, that we can be overwhelmed, right? And we can be a little bit confused. We can be worried about trying medication. We can be worried about the stigma associated with trying medication. But also you can be excited about the future and excited about how you can reinterpret your life. Not your life, but view what you've done through a new lens. There's also a lot of advice that comes up at this time. Uncle Rob's, my wife's name is actually Karen. So Karen with the essential oils. But we can also, have the therapist, but I learned to trust in myself and trust in experts with this, not the mean bully myself sitting on my corner. So the physician, the psychologist, my therapist, who all, trust this. So I've used therapy as a lot for ADHD-specific therapy to talk about that. I've also started using ADHD medication, and this has been helped immensely. So in school and university, my performance was very, very inconsistent. I got into grad schools always just right at the very edge of the academic cutoff, right there, because I had a lot of A's, and if I really didn't like the course, I could get a C. I just wouldn't do it. So it was like spinning a wheel, right? Didn't know if I was going to actually be able to concentrate, do it. If I really didn't enjoy it, it was really difficult to do. Since starting medication, I can concentrate and I have a lot more wins. I still worry about it, but I do have a lot more wins, and I'm able to do a lot of those things, particularly the things that I don't normally want to do. I used to think I lacked discipline, but of course I just had undiagnosed ADHD. So I was diagnosed with ADHD. My son was diagnosed with ADHD. I looked back in my family history and I realized that I actually have a whole long family history of ADHD autism. My 13-year-old daughter is also autistic, or she's autistic. My brother and my mother and my grandfather on that side are autistic. I have 2 cousins. One cousin is autistic, the other one is ADHD. Their kids all have either diagnosed with either ADHD or autism. So certainly in my family, there's a very, very strong heritable component, right? So, that part also helps square with what it is and helps me deal with it in the workplace, because I do feel a lot of shame and I feel a lot of difficulty when I say I have it, because a lot of people don't often believe it, and the acceptance and recognition of it can be difficult, and it's not always widespread. So one of the things that a lot of people who without ADHD seem to grasp, so it's not a matter of trying harder. Everyone struggles with getting tasks done at some point, right? It's how and why we struggle with it, right? We all have to tread water at some point. but it's how we do it and how much work we do it and how much we have to try in order to do some things. So I do feel some pushback. I don't feel it with, it's very rare at Carleton, to be honest. But there is a little bit of sort of, societal level pushback. And one of them sort of in my head, and this is sort of based on, how I feel, is like, oh no, I'm just being lazy, right? And so what is being lazy? Well, of course, lazy people, the reason they're avoiding the task is they can try and avoid it and then they don't have to do the work, right? And they feel good about having avoided doing the work. But people who aren't lazy, like, obsess over the task with their mind begging them, just do it, right? I have in my head all the things I need to do. It's like, just do them. Some of them are phone calls that I know would take 30 seconds. I just can't do it. It also, laziness doesn't usually have shame and inadequacy from it, but it's also not the same as an executive dysfunction. So this is sort of part of what I say about recognizing it, is that in the workplace, it can be really difficult to recognize what someone with ADHD looks like. I've never looked like someone who has ADHD, I don't think, except that I can sometimes be a little bit gregarious and chatty. And the way people who work with me on projects know that I do things very last minute. It always gets done in time. But it sometimes looks just like someone sitting on the corner, on a phone, ignoring things, right? So did you get your stuff? You're just chilling? No, not remotely. You've got all these things going on, all these distractions. So recognizing that someone who has ADHD, might not look like it. And they might not necessarily know that they need help as well. Some of this has to do with some of the common things that we think of, being able to start a task, right? ADHD people tend to find it really hard, and I find it really hard to break my tasks up into small, discrete components. And if I can't break it up into small, discrete components, I can't do it. It sits as one big lump and I can't even start it. So rather than saying, okay, I do this, A, B, C, D, E, I sit in front of me with the whole alphabet and I can't start it because I don't know which letter comes first. And unless I know what letter comes first, I can't get going. And I have to sort that all out in my head ahead of time. And that part can be really hard to do. Other thing is something which is related to working memory. Again, it's executive dysfunction, and this relates a lot to sort of how ADHD is. And so I'll sort of let you read this sort of as we go along. But with ADHD, we tend to have a lot of things in our head going on, and we have a lot of trouble remembering these sort of things. So this idea of what time is it? So with my talk today, trying to remember what time it was. Okay, it's at 1 o'clock. Right, what time is it? It's 11:15. How long do I have? I don't know. I should make lunch. I should make sure I have some tea. Okay, what about the kids? Do they have everything? The dogs, are they have water? What if the dogs don't? All going on in my head. So I have trouble then remembering everything that's going on. So remembering what I just read, remembering a phone number, remembering what I wanted to order, or recalling things, recalling someone's name. It really came to light for me when I was teaching a 4th-year stats course. So I worked at Stats Canada. I have a PhD in sociology and demography, which is a stats-based program. It's half of my PhD courses, 7 courses were in stats at the graduate level. And I had trouble explaining to students the mean, median, and mode, which, my kids are studying in grade 5, or really they're already studying in grade 2. But being able to recall that and recall those words in a second in the class was very, very difficult. So my brains had to learn different ways of coping with this, right? About the way I do it. So I have to use external reminders often. So I've set up a lot of external reminders for myself on how I do things, where I place objects in the house so I don't forget them. If they're out of place, I forget them. The time I do things during the day, if I don't do them at that time, I forget it. I often have to have an external reminder for medications as well, because if I don't get up at a certain time, walk down, pour my water, take my medication, I have no idea if I did it, or things like that, or where things are in the house. If I decide and I move things and I don't put it back exactly where it was, it's gone. So this is sort of one thing with working memory. And this then relates as well to task organization, which I talked about. I love these little comics, by the way. Pina, who does these comics, is amazing. ADHDalien.com. I'm a Patreon supporter of hers as well. So there are strategies that people can use. So just write it down, but that doesn't actually work for me. I have an iPad with a journal part on it with a to-do reminder. I have my Outlook to-do reminder list. I have a Gmail one. I have my calendar. I have a paper copy one. I have other ones. The only one that works for me is the one I'm using right now. It's really hard to keep one consistent and keep doing it. Sometimes they work for a while, and that's what I do with the task stuff. But oftentimes they only work for a short while, and then I tend to lose my way, and it gets even worse. And then, the strategies don't work, and then I feel even worse. And because I have ADHD, I should know better, right? Right. Another thing that ADHD folks have is this idea of, in ADHD lingo, we call it rejection sensitivity dysphoria, RSD. And so this is a perception of rejection that is a more extreme perception of rejection over small things. And so social media can be a really bad part about it, but it can also happen in terms of criticism, in terms of getting criticism back from articles. Everyone finds it hard to read the reviewer notes from articles, or when you submit a grant and it doesn't get funded, and reviewing the comments. But the perceived rejection of it being a rejection of me as an individual can be particularly strong for ADHD people, even with my mind jump to conclusions. Maybe that's a little bit about what I talked about before, about sometimes people don't seem to accept those with ADHD, and it could just be my perceived rejection, going on about that, but maybe not. These all relate to something what we call executive functioning or executive dysfunction. And ADHD Alien talks about that, right? And this is sort of, why can't I do this? Why can't you do the simplest things? What if I don't have ADHD? What if I'm just lazy? Did I fool my doctor? Did I fool myself? And then you come at me coming back on, it's like, no, it's a real neurological issue. I know I'm not the only one. I'll learn to understand my brain. I'm coming for executive dysfunction. I need to give myself this pep talk quite often. Executive functioning, this is the only sort of like academic-y sort of thing, is something that you can divide up into these different sort of 8 areas. And there's a whole bunch of different books called Smart But Scattered, and there's a whole bunch of them about it. So for workplace, for success, for kids, for teens, that are really good, and they're really divide this executive functioning into 8 different areas on impulse control, emotional control, flexible thinking, working memory, which I sort of talked about, planning and organization, task initiation. So only some of these things are ones that we think of when we think of ADHD and we can see. A lot of these are sort of ones that we can't see. So if we look at the workplace and we look at these different aspects of executive functioning, well, how do we actually help ourselves, and how can we help ourselves? Well, so planning. One of the things that we can do, both managers and people in the workplace, to help accommodate for this, is to know that planning applies to both small and large tasks. So you need to plan small tasks as well as big tasks, right? Plan your day, plan your workplace. I've learned to, at the end of the day, I write down what I'm going to start with the next day. Otherwise, I just don't do anything. And I sometimes will quite literally do nothing then. I will reply to emails and that's sort of it. but I won't actually do anything else. Have lots of templates and tools for doing things, time planning templates, different tools for planning, different Excel sheets and things like that. I find it easiest to plan projects with someone as a team, not in myself, particularly to assist in breaking down the tasks and help me get all these different ideas and put them into some sort of coherent whole. Task initiation and starting and stopping things. So one of the ways I can do it is you start a task with someone else. So, beginning of the day, it's like, I'll go work on this, you go work on this, and we'll check back with each other in a couple hours and see if we do that. Or use cues to start tasks. Cues can be, I often do that when I'm doing writing, not right now because it's a pandemic, but when I'm actually doing my academic writing of journal articles, I write in a coffee shop. And so my cue is sitting down at the table in the coffee shop with a coffee and a pair of headphones, and knowing I'm going to have 3 hours uninterrupted. Other things don't work late or at home. With ADHD folks, we sometimes tend to overwork and get hyper-focused into things. So I've made it a really strict rule that at the end of the day, I stop. I don't work late. And I try not to work at home. Obviously, the pandemic has really impacted this, and I'll talk about that later. Or you set a time limit for tasks, use timers and Pomodoros. Evaluating progress, I find having clear expectations is really good, and evaluation frameworks. When I worked in the federal government, this was something that they had sort of as routine there. I didn't realize I had undiagnosed ADHD, and I found these sort of things could be quite difficult. But also reviewing this with other people about my progress has really helped. So knowing that where I'm at. So part of it is that I might not know where I'm at in a project or have difficulty. Other things are in that I may have in the back of my head thinking, I'm about to fail. I'm not doing really well. I'm not doing this great. I have this constant negative self-talk going on in the back of my head. So reviewing things together can provide affirmation that I'm actually doing okay. Speeding up and slowing down, this can be hard. I sort of align it with switching tasks. And this is when you all of a sudden have to do things faster, or you need to do things slower to catch more errors or be a little more careful with things. Part of it is I find that you need to monitor and record task times. So knowing how long things take to doing that. So I often do this with reviewing grant applications. So if I'm on a grant review committee, I might have 30 applications to go through. I need to know how long it's going to take me to go through each application. And I have to monitor that, because then I have to either speed up or I have to make sure I allocate more time, because I often have no idea. And I'm like, oh, I can just do that the night before. Not with 30-page applications, you can't. But my ADHD brain thinks I can. Sure, I'll just get up early. Seriously, I think that sometimes. Thankfully, I have my wife who organizes everything. Switching tasks can be really, really hard. And this is hard in an environment where you get distracted a lot. So distractions can be really, really hard for me, and I can just not go back to my other tasks. Similarly, if I have a task that I'm doing, I'm really focused into it, having to switch and do something else can be difficult. I often find it easiest to take a break, to physically get up, go walk to the coffee shop. I often will walk to Tim Hortons or go for a walk. Or now that I'm at the pandemic, I go outside and check on my gardens. They were the same as I checked on them before. But or a clear your mind worksheet, having a worksheet where you just write down all the thoughts in your head and get them out of there. They're there on the piece of paper. You've got them out. Now you can go focus up on there. Time estimation, as I said, my time estimation can be really poor. ADHD people often have that. It's really good to keep track of your time on how much it is, how much long it takes. Having someone else to help you. I Google things a lot on how long things should take, and then I always add more time. And then have externally monitored time. I often look at how much time I spend doing things by using electronic timers, and how much time did I spend with my Safari open versus my Outlook open versus Microsoft Word open, something like that. Focusing, routine. is really, really important for me. Setting a routine and keeping it sort of week after week. That's not easy for faculty academics, where our routine is anything but routine. But I find it really important to try and do that. So I try and set my meetings for one day. I try and set my teaching, around where my teaching is. I set my student meetings, I set my admin meetings, and then I always block off certain times during the week where it's, I won't allow any meetings. And those are times where I can work on stuff that I actually want to work on, and I'm pretty good with that. Using headphones, avoiding cubicle environments. Cubicle environments are really, really, really hard for people with ADHD. They're both quiet and distracting, which is sort of like the worst of both worlds. I mean, I can't think of anyone who says, "Oh, I loved working in cubicles. That was like the best time of my life." I've never heard anyone say that. But we can use things to sort of help with that, using headphones, physical tools. When I say toys, I say this. In my office at work at Carleton, which I've been in for a long time, I have little pedals that go underneath that I can use for when I'm writing, try to help with things. So these are all things that we can sort of do. We can also draw on stuff that we do for our kids, right? So here's a thing on how to help kids succeed with chores, right? So rather than say do the laundry, when, which, how do you do it? So when they use an example of what they call buttons, right? So you only have a certain number of buttons during the day. If you take 3 buttons just to figure out how to do the laundry, then you've used them all and you don't have anything left to actually do it, right? So rather than writing down the tasks and saying I do this, 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 and this, right? These are just sort of simple examples, but I find really important, even for things that are seemingly basic. How has working from home affected me? Well, a lot, right? So, I often find myself, daydreaming rather than being deep in thought. I don't get that time to focus. And I have a lot of trouble prioritizing, right? And losing track of what needs to be done. And so work becomes super overwhelmed. Part of it is that I don't have a dedicated space to work. A lot of us don't. We share it. I used to have the dining room. My youngest son's now taken that over because he needs the big screen because he's got really bad eyes and can't see the screen. Or excessive snacking, coffee drinking, online gaming, right? Which is a form of self-medication. Or I feel like I can only manage other household chores, right? So you feel guilty for not doing enough. Or I end up not taking any breaks. And I often think I'm doing breaks because I'm not doing work, but my breaks are, okay, the kids have a break right now. Okay, kids, you go outside. I'll quickly get some work done here. Then I'll make you lunch and then I'll get back to work. But that's not a work because, that's not a break. So I can't work or I don't know how long I can work for. So things are only sort of break. My sleeping habits are really bad because I tend to stay up late or get up early. Then I get easily distracted. And then the stress of fighting your head all day with ADHD can do that. So there's all these sort of things. So the whole work from home thing has been, uniformly difficult, I think, for ADHD folks. There probably could be some that find it really good. And I like to work from home sometimes, but just not all the time. And part of it is the lack of colleagues, right? Without colleagues nearby, there's less accountability. There's no one sort of looking over my shoulder. And it's not even like there's actually someone asking. It's this social accountability. And that's part of why I like working in coffee shops so much, right? And things like that. And so these are the coping skills that I've developed. Stopped working. So this sort of contributes to, I'll leave this one at the back there, to this cycle of what they call ADHD burnout, where they've got this. So what she's done is she's created, Pina, that the author, has created this sort of cycle of these different things that ADHD people can do, which the negatives, but then has also provided some learn to do and some strategies within that, right? So there's this routine procrastination, right? With self-medication. Self-medicating can just be coffee. I drink a lot of tea and caffeine. That's how I got myself through university. Incredible amounts of caffeine. I also had really bad allergies when I did my PhD in Texas. So I took to taking just pseudoephedrine and double dosing pseudoephedrine just to deal with my medication. So I was on double doses of pseudoephedrine plus copious amounts of caffeine, which is a real poor substitute for actual ADHD medication. But I somehow made it through. I don't know. And then you have this sort of cycle. One of the before I do the many things, one of the things I find in the workplace that I found has been most helpful to me is this recognition from people and recognizing that people with ADHD and other neurodiversities. I've only talked about ADHD, as I said. My daughter's on the autism spectrum, or is autistic. Is sort of recognizing it and accepting it, and realizing that my experience with how my ADHD diagnosis and what I find difficult is how I feel it, and that's not necessarily how others do. So it's only sort of one way of feeling ADHD. It might look like something different for someone else. I actually have quite a few friends now who are ADHD, and we all look different. All the adults with ADHD look different, and all the kids with ADHD look different. Of course, there's some similarities, and we laugh at the similarities together. But there's a lot of differences, and I think knowing that, and I think in the workplace we really need to recognize that. So thank you for listening to my slightly rambling discussion about ADHD in the workplace. I really appreciate it. I'm really thankful that I've been able to get to that. And I have a lot of, I draw on a lot of support from ADHD Twitter, Instagram. You see that the cartoons and things like that I did, I showed throughout it are largely from Twitter and Instagram, through what people call the neurodiverse squad. A few notes on that is I wanted to say, I have been looking at the chat, number one, but I'm only talking about one type of neurodiversity, and I'm talking about it from my perspective. I've chosen to be open about my ADHD, partly because I'm fairly privileged in my work position. I'm secure. I'm a tenured associate professor. I'm male, cisgendered, white, living in Canada. So I have the opportunity to be open about this. And I've chosen to be open partially so that not to claim accommodations, but to be able to talk about it and raise awareness so that those who don't feel comfortable raising their voice or disclosing may not have to. And so that's sort of why I've chosen to be that. And I recognize that, my abilities to get diagnosed was relatively simple, and it required a fair bit of financial means and the means of my workplace to be able to do that. And not everyone has that ability. So I do want to recognize that, and that's sort of where I'm coming from. But sort of hoping that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see people and so see
Paul,
if, yeah.
It's Kath. I'm just going to jump in at this point, just to first say thank you for creating a sense of home for many people. The chat has been absolutely, many people have been moved, and your vulnerability has been able to do that and open up minds and hearts. I'm just going to hand it over to Tara because I'm getting choked up, and because it's just been very powerful. So thank you. And Tara will facilitate this next part.
Yeah, I haven't read the chat yet. So
yeah, we've been monitoring.
We've
been monitoring it, so that's why we're going to monitor it for you. So over to Tara.
Yeah.
Well, and let's also model, like when we're talking about workplaces,
Right.
right? The expectation of monitoring a chat when one is doing a presentation or is engaged in a meeting, right? That is also something that is tough. Certainly I find it tough for myself, and I'm often telling colleagues that. So even being able to have those conversations with our colleagues about where our attention can be best focused in a moment. So yes, it's my pleasure to be able to do the thank yous and the wrap ups for us today, Paul. So thank you very much for this. I think it's, I saw through the chat certainly that lots of people are resonating with this, either for themselves or they're recognizing a family member, they're recognizing certain behaviors. But what I really love about what you're doing today and what this series is, like why we came up with this series, is to promote sort of awareness into action. And what you provided today was tons of awareness, but lots of possibilities for actioning that as well too, and what those strategies are.
Thanks.
You did a fantastic job. Executive functions is sort of like this mystery cloud that kind of goes around, and we hear about it a lot. But so I think you did a great job of demonstrating how those executive functions can challenge us for anybody at a certain point, and certainly with ADHD, when those parts are impacted, what that can mean in a daily life. You did a great job of talking about the now and not now of things, explaining the exhaustion that can come from masking and mitigating all the time. That was super excellent, because I think for people who don't, you know, sometimes people can take things in through osmosis, or for instance, the tasks of things for folks who are neurotypical kind of show up like this for them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah, I know my daughter who's autistic, she talks about that a lot, the absolutely exhaustion. She'll often just sort of, you know, we're like, do you want to watch a show? She's like, listen, I'm just done being not autistic right now. And I need to go to my room and just hyper focus on this one YouTube video and learn everything I need to learn about this.
And you did a great job of also talking about some of those pieces that, so when we think about this series, this is about cracking open spaces for all sorts of people. It's about accessibility. And this first part, we've really chosen to focus on neurodivergency and, you know, a full neurodiversity of thinkers. And in that, you brought up a really interesting one around how with ADHD, I like to sometimes call it the magical unicorn effect, but we sometimes refer to it as body doubling too. When someone just being in your space can be enough to get that momentum going. And you're really making a distinction between what laziness is and what's really going on for folks when those executive functions are stopping things up. So I think I just want to say thank you so much for all of that insight. And I appreciate that you also acknowledged that, you know, everyone's diverse and that there's privileges to certain things too, and that we have to remain mindful of how we think and talk about these things. It's really a matter of, again, creating more spaces and more accessibility, not about sort of just deciding there is one representation of these things. So the more conversations we have about this. So I saw some things in the chat. I'm supposed to facilitate a tiny moment or two of some questions and answers for you. So I'll direct a few things to you, and certainly let people know too that you've got your contact information in there too, and I know that you are open to people checking in with you on that.
Via email, via Twitter DMs. I will actually also post this up on my lab website, just sort of as under my resources. I do always try and do things like that.
Fantastic. So one of the things, as someone did ask early on, what was you actually spoke to it a little bit now, what was your relationship to caffeine before the involvement of meds for you?
Yeah, I did speak a little bit about that. And yeah, it was, you know, I did drink a lot of coffee, preferably strong coffee. I wandered around campus in Birkenstocks and socks. I'm from the West. And just with like this giant Starbucks mug of coffee constantly. And I would show up to class exactly on time, like right before the door closed, sit right in the front. And I couldn't listen to the prof and take notes at the same time. So my mentor and advisor for my undergrad and my master's said it used to drive him nuts, because I would sit in the very front middle of the class with a cup of coffee, and I would sit back and just listen, and I would take not a single note. He said it would drive him nuts, and I would then get an A in his classes because I liked his classes. And I would do a lot. I do have to say that if being all open, it wasn't only legal drugs that I was into. I've never struggled with addiction, but I know I did use alcohol and other recreational drugs as compensating mechanisms in the past.
And
so,
but thank you for sharing that as well,
yeah.
too. I think that's something for people to be mindful of, that in particular with ADHD, that some of those things are particularly young folks will gravitate to those because some of them work for them in terms of the coping, right? That doesn't mean it's going to be necessarily the most healthy coping mechanism, but it's working and it's functioning for them. And so the more we create spaces where we can support with like reducing cognitive load, like having some of those routines, having some of those things at play, or at least more of them available, and it being really normed in our environment, those are just more choices around what can help with the coping.
I think I have really bad seasonal allergies. So I can't really, any smoke or actually even beer makes my seasonal allergies go absolutely nuts. So it's almost like a safety mechanism my body's developed. So as a teenager, I could never do that.
So I'll also pull in some of the things that people have been saying around. So in the workplace, for you, I guess I'll ask, what for you, from your experience, has been something that has been helpful in the post-secondary work environment, because that's who we're talking about that right now, in terms of supporting you in particular, and will be different for other folks with ADHD, but given right now we're in that online environment, and you were talking about how that's not always set up super awesome. For folks, maybe there's a lack not as many transitions, which is super nice, but the rest of it, there's some of those routines and those structures that are in place to support us.
I think there's a couple of things. So one thing during the pandemic was it sort of came to a head in the early spring here, was that for me, we were allowed onto campus to work if it was only for things that couldn't be done off campus. And it sort of really got to the point where I realized that me not being able to work, I could only work in my office on campus. I really couldn't work at home. So for me, it was either I had to take time off work, which I can't do because I'm supervising so many students, or I had to be able to get access to my office. And seeing it as an accessibility issue, being able to return to work and go into my office. Now I went to my office and sat by myself and didn't see anyone all day, but I was able to actually function and work. But seeing that as like, no, that's actually essential. Otherwise, my work can't be completed because I just wasn't unable to do it. Because of unable to focus, unable to plan, unable to task initiate. And during that time when I was going to my office, I haven't since this last re-lockdown. I was incredibly productive, but seeing that. Other things are, thankfully, my chair has been very gracious in that is that I can have my finances and stuff and the very students I manage have that submitted by the departmental administrators. Having someone else do that for me, because while I can submit it and I can do it, I almost always get them returned with mistakes. I don't have that attention to detail, right? Number one, it takes me twice as long. Number two, I almost always get it returned with mistakes, which is a pain for me and it's a pain for the other administrators because they're having to fix my mistakes. So
and I think that brings I think that brings up something really important too around thriving and not sitting in a place of shame, right? You did bring that up as well too. And I think that's important for all colleagues to kind of understand in the sense that there's going to be a ton of things where you're going to put your superpowers to work and you're going to rock. And there's going to be other things, just like everybody else, that you won't rock as much. And so if we're able to have good, solid communication about that, then putting all the bulk of your time and energy into the administrative tasks,
accounting tasks,
that are not your wheelhouse, versus then some of the outside of the box thinking that you might be bringing, or some of the other pieces where you're probably really right on with the students, like you're very present, because a lot of folks with ADHD are like right now, they're in the now, and it makes them excellent in these areas. So I think finding a place, as with all colleagues, where people are able to thrive and not actually have to work against themselves in order to fit the system is a great way for us to consider how do we create more space around all sorts of ways of thinking.
Yeah, for sure. Someone said accounting and things like that, that's a big one. Yeah, thankfully my wife is really good at that. I have one credit card bill that I'm responsible for. She's responsible for every single thing, every else. At the beginning of the pandemic, it was 90 days late. I just forgot completely. I have one bill that I'm responsible for. It's the only one that's ever late. I just can't, no matter how much I try.
So there were some questions too about assessment, where the online assessments are, diagnosis, and those types of things. I know that certainly I open that up to people to continue to reach out to, because as you mentioned, a couple of the different professionals that can do it. If you want to talk about the actual online one, you're welcome to. And then I'm going to wrap us up in about 2 minutes from now.
Yeah, the online forms and things like that, you know, even the doctors give that. The form that I provided, the ADHD adult questionnaire, is one that a lot of family physicians use as a screening questionnaire for when you have a discussion with them about ADHD. It's one that's a sort of a start. Most physicians, in order to diagnose ADHD, they require a psychologist or psychiatrist to diagnose, which can be very time consuming and expensive. Thankfully, you know, Carleton has a very great health plan. The last university I worked at did not have a very good health plan with mental health. So it had a very low cap. Carleton is great for faculty. So it's like, yeah, about $2,000 for a whole full diagnostic assessment. Minimum wait time, sort of 4 to 6 months. And sometimes for children, if you really want to see a certain specialist, then they can be even longer. And then it takes also, about 4 or 5 meetings. They give you a questionnaire, spouse partner questionnaire, family questionnaire, things like that. So it can also take a long time. Once I had that diagnosis, I was able to look at medication. But without that, my own family physician wouldn't. Some physicians will look at medication before that. Some of my friends have, but some don't. I find often with kids, they're a lot closer. With young adults, it's rare that they will prescribe medication without a full formal assessment, because there's this fear and stigma of substance abuse. If someone gets over their shame to be able to ask a doctor for this assessment, then they're not going to abuse it. I think the fear and shame of stigma and stigma associated with substance abuse is more than the actual abuse that goes on. Someone did mention about medication. It took me a couple times to get the right dosage and the right medication. I've switched medications since then. For me, I switched from Concerta, which I like to joke is a meth substance, to Vyvanse, which is a speed substance. And to learn that I had to use the label. I couldn't use a generic brand because they have different peaks and troughs. So, but that works with me. Other people, it's different. So it really takes a lot of time and playing.
I want to say thank you so much for today. I know that lots of people have probably more to think about and talk about, and to let people know that in this series, we've also planned that we're going to probably have one of the days where we come together and find out how have people been engaging with this series. Are they, what are they feeling about it? What are some of the pieces that the aha moments that they're getting in terms of our healthy workplace here at Carleton, and to inform the accessibility series as it goes along. So this has been a fantastic next piece to what we're doing, and we're looking forward to having you be part of discussions again, Paul. I saw that Kathy had mentioned maybe doing something like this again. Certainly this recording will be available, but one thing we knew as soon as we did the launch with how many people were coming out to hear about neurodiversity is that it is a topic that's of importance here in the community. So there are going to be lots of opportunities that we will provide for people to come together and continue talking about this, getting strategies, connecting together. I think that's what this has been really important for, is also that shared understanding of everyone here in the campus community that this is an important part of our lives, and it's one to be valued and one to understand and one to connect about. So really appreciate again. And Sam has also provided me what I should be mentioning at the end, which is that there will be a feedback survey. And I highly encourage people to put into it what they would like to see more of through this, and that we've got more to come. So thank you so much for today, Paul. And we thank everyone else for coming here. Feel free to reach out to any of us here if you have questions.
And also just a note for self-care for those that are here as well. This can be, might be triggering. You might be hearing a story for the first time and thinking, this is me, this is my husband, this is my child. it's part of why we want to do this, is raising awareness, but recognizing that individual experiences may be impacted. So a reminder to take some space, reach out for help. You can reach out to one of us for more information, and continue the conversation.